the end of the Civil War this spring. We'd like to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Constitution Center, and the American Library Association for their support of the exhibit and tonight's activities. We'd also like to thank our campus sponsors, the Carnahan-Jackson Foundation, the Faculty Student Association, and the Gravener-Bennett History Department Cultural Fund. We have planned several other events in conjunction with the exhibit, and these can be found on both sides of the flyers that should have been on your seats when you arrived. I would also like to personally thank Professor Jennifer Hildebrand of the History Department for doing all of the legwork associated with putting this together. Now, the Civil War continues to inspire a great deal of interest in the United States. It has really, it really has a tremendous hold on the American imagination, so to speak. A search on Amazon for books about the Civil War, which I did this afternoon, resulted in over 250,000 results. Recently, political pundits have noted that the red state, blue state divide, the electoral divide, mirrors that of the slave state, free state divide during the Civil War era. Not quite 2 years ago, close to 300,000 people descended on the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in order to experience the reenactment of parts of that battle that took place 150 years ago. Just this Monday, on the front page of the New York Times, there was a story about an upcoming Supreme Court case in which the court will decide whether the Texas Department of Motor Vehicles must offer specialty license plates bearing the Confederate battle flag. It seems that the Civil War is all around us, even 150 years after its end. So we might be forgiven if we're a bit surprised at the title of our talk tonight, "The Civil War is Over." Our speaker tonight, Professor Fitzhugh Brundage from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, is uniquely qualified to speak to us on this topic. To list all of his honors and publications would take more time than we have tonight, so I will just highlight a few. He is a recipient of a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship, and he is the author of several books. Most recently, he has published The Southern Past, A Clash of Race and Memory, which received the Lillian Smith Award from the Southern Regional Council and the Charles Sidner Award, recognizing it as a distinguished book in Southern history from the Southern Historical Association. His book, A Socialist Utopia in the New South, the Ruskin colonies in Tennessee and Georgia, was named a Choice Outstanding Academic Book of the Year. He is also the editor of Beyond Blackface, African Americans and the Creation of American Popular Culture, 1890 to 1930, and Booker T. Washington and Black Progress, a centenary of Up from Slavery. And just to give you a sense of how fully his publications run the gamut of Southern culture, I'll add that he has recently authored an article entitled "From Grits to the Allman Brothers: Why Americans Look to the South for Authentic Culture." Would you please join me in welcoming Professor Brundage?
Well, it's my distinct pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Jennifer and Mary Beth for being wonderful hosts, and I've really enjoyed, I haven't been here that long, but I've enjoyed every minute I've been here. I will say, when I first learned, I didn't know this previously, but when I first learned that you all were the Blue Devils, I was a little concerned. You know, there's a school 8 miles from Chapel Hill that are also the Blue Devils, and I'm much happier to be here than I would be to be there. So I'll leave it at that. Seriously, it is a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I should say my title is somewhat facetious, but I also am going to push back in a way against what Mary Beth was saying. And I will try to argue that the Civil War is over. We all know that Lee surrendered at Appomattox almost 150 years ago, well, next month. But I'll offer some other examples to sort of affirm what Mary Beth was saying, that there are plenty of people who aren't sure that that surrender really resolved that conflict. It was a little more than a decade ago that historian David Goldfield published a book with the title Still Fighting the Civil War. And the premise of the book is that many of the issues, many of the cultural conflicts that gave birth to the Civil War continue to be waged. In the spring of 2011, so 4 years ago now, the Pew Research Center released data from a poll in which more than a half, 56% of Americans, said that the Civil War is still relevant. I don't know what they meant by still relevant, but that's what they said. But I'm here to tell you that the Civil War exerts less and less of a grip on the American imagination. The Civil War is finally, I'd like to suggest, in the process of making that transition from being part of our memory, our national memory, being part of our national history. And I'm borrowing this idea of the transition from memory to history from the French scholar Pierre Nora. Now, I'm not going to inflict Nora's obtuse language on you. Like most French academics, he's got to develop his own vocabulary and then imposes it on you. I'm not going to inflict that on you, but I think there is really some utility in this idea. It focuses our attention on important changes in the intensity and the gravitas of contemporary discussions of the Civil War. So my simple claim is that the Civil War has finally receded into the recalled past where it attracts the attention largely of enthusiasts and scholars. And I'm not suggesting that's bad. This is not a criticism, this is an observation. For at least a century after the Civil War, Americans fought the original culture wars over the meaning of the conflict. In visual arts, literature, music, film, scholarship, and partisan politics, Americans contested the origins, the course, and the outcome of the war. But now in the 21st century, the Civil War no longer provides either a pretext or a context for comparable cultural contests. Some of us may lament that the Civil War is receding into history, and that the nation may fail to recognize the full import of the Civil War. Yet in other regards, I think we can take a measure of comfort that the war is less often now a plaything of ill-informed politicians, cranks, and all manner of other fools. Now, on what basis do I claim the Civil War is receding into the rearview mirror of history? I'm going to offer 3 brief case studies this evening. Taken together, I hope these examples will demonstrate, 1, that the Civil War is salient to a much smaller audience than in the past. 2, that it's no longer easily or usefully exploited by ideologues or even well-meaning politicians. And 3, it's no longer sacrosanct. To find evidence of the shrinking audience for all things Civil War is not difficult. And I'm going to start with an anecdotal bit of information that I derived from a friend of mine who's been the director of the Stonewall Jackson House in Lexington, Virginia for 3 decades now. As some of you may know, the Stonewall Jackson House was originally a shrine. It was the only house Stonewall Jackson owned. He owned it while he was a professor. It Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia. And it was a shrine to him that was turned into a hospital. Now it has been turned into a historic house museum. Well, from her vantage point, as director of this site for 3 decades, she has witnessed a peak of visitorship in the early 1990s. And then since the 1990s, there has been a steady decline in attendance at the Stonewall Jackson House. Visitorship is off at least a third from its peak. And there's been a slight uptick during the Centennial. But there have been similar declines in visitorship at other Civil War sites across the nation. And I should add, this is true of, if any of you know about Colonial Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg's attendance is going steadily down. So this is not just unique to Civil War sites. Well, yes, the 150th anniversary, especially at Gettysburg, has sparked an increase in visitorship. But the trend lines, I think, are unmistakable. Equally striking evidence of the decline in popular interest in the Civil War is the contrast between the current Centennial and the Centennial celebrated 5 decades ago. The difference in the scale between the 2 commemorations is striking. And let me see if this will move. Maybe we'll move this time. There we go. In North Carolina, between 1961 and 1965, I'm using North Carolina just as an example. There's nothing specifically important about North Carolina as opposed to any other state. But nevertheless, in North Carolina, between 1961 and 1965, Centennial observations included a litany of public events. There were displays, exhibits, dedications, and of course, reenactments. The organization and the coordination of these events was assigned to an independent sub-office, which was created in 1958 and received a one-time congressional grant of $100,000, which is equivalent to approximately $750,000 today. It's not a large sum of money, but on the other hand, not an insignificant sum. This office had an annual budget during the 5 years of the Centennial, and I think it may have even had an annual budget starting in �58 for this amount. So it may have been for 7 years. It had an annual budget of $60,000, which is equivalent to about $440,000 a year. Again, not a huge amount of money, but not trivial. In contrast, the North Carolina State Legislature has appropriated no dedicated fund for the sesquicentennial. Not a penny. State-funded historical organizations in North Carolina that have organized and conducted the sesquicentennial programs in the state have redeployed existing budgets and staff. And I should point out, you could say, well, that's because they've been dealing with the consequences of the Great Recession, but these plans were started before the Great Recession even started, so there was no plan ever in the 2000s to devote state funding towards Centennial, in sharp contrast to the Centennial. And who in our contemporary society is paying attention to the sesquicentennial? Well, I can tell you that my students are. During the past 3 years, I polled my students to see if they're aware of the 150th anniversary ceremonies. I'm relieved to report they can all do the math, and they've all figured out that this is the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, but not a single one of my students has attended a single sesquicentennial event or are aware of any organized events related to the sesquicentennial in the state of North Carolina. To the extent that there is an audience for the sesquicentennial, it encompasses serious readers, collectors, buffs, reenactors, battlefield preservationists, and educators. All wonderful, wonderful audiences. I thank you all for being here. But however diverse and enthusiastic these groups we may be, we are a small subculture within the general population. By way of contrast, the ceremonies of the Civil War Centennial often drew large crowds, not quite as large as the sesquicentennial reenactment at Gettysburg, but still very substantial crowds, received broad media attention, and then, my point here, provoked all manner of commercial exploitation. So as a child, during the Centennial, you could buy lots of things, and some of these demonstrate, that would have alerted your attention to the Centennial. There are, of course, all manner of things, and then, of course, the U.S. government was releasing a whole series of stamps related to the Centennial. The sesquicentennial almost certainly has garnered much less public attention because it doesn't resonate with current events to the degree that the Centennial did. The 100th anniversary of the Civil War became bound up inextricably in the contemporary struggle for civil rights and African American equality. In 1961, for example, a national meeting of the state Centennial Commissions, like the one that was organizing the events in North Carolina that I mentioned. Well, at this national meeting of state Centennial Commissions, it was to take place at the Francis Marion Hotel in Charleston, South Carolina, coinciding also with the firing on Fort Sumter in April 1961, 100 years after 1861. The event was going to include a reenactment of the firing with fireworks display, and then the business of the assembly would get underway. Well, the New Jersey delegation included Madeline Williams, an African-American woman. Beforehand, she contacted the host in Charleston to make sure that she would not be compelled to accept segregated facilities at the Francis Marion Hotel or elsewhere in Charleston during the meeting. There were increasingly tense negotiations between the event organizers and the New Jersey delegation. Compromise failed, and Mrs. Williams informed the state Centennial Commissions that she would not abide by local segregation laws. She wouldn't attend, and the New Jersey delegation wasn't going to attend. The New Jersey delegation also encouraged other states to not participate in the meeting. The resulting uproar snowballed, threatening to derail the Centennial commemoration as a whole, even prompting officials within the newly sworn-in John F. Kennedy administration to try to defuse the situation. This is just one example, then, of the coincidence of the civil rights struggle and the Centennial that constantly drew the attention of Americans to the legacy, the immediate legacy of the Civil War. Well, the coincidence of the Centennial and the intensifying civil rights campaigns of the 1960s ensured that political leaders and private citizens alike invoked the anniversary of the Civil War throughout the controversies declared between 61 and 65. Think, for example, of the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King, of course, gave his poignant plea for a nation free of the light of racism. The March on Washington coincided with the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. As a result, then, the Centennial and the controversies surrounded were often front-page news, and few Americans were ambivalent, much less unaware of it, like my students are in present-day North Carolina. The sesquicentennial, then, is taking place in a substantially different political and racial environment. Of course, controversies over persisting racial discrimination persist, as, for example, the upheaval in Ferguson and elsewhere demonstrates. But the relevance of the Civil War to these controversies is seldom obvious. Overt racial politics have not been a factor in sesquicentennial commemorations as far as I know. And here, I'll go back and use the example of North Carolina. Michael Hill, who's the research supervisor for the North Carolina Department of Archives and History, and one of the planners for North Carolina's sesquicentennial programs, recalls that an African-American state representative did urge the sesquicentennial planners to ensure that racial issues were not overlooked in the commemoration. But otherwise, there was no suggestion, no recommendation to deal or to plan on how to deal with questions of race and the racial implications of contemporary events in the Civil War. So to date, the sesquicentennial linger a little longer on the politics of Civil War memory. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, white Southern politicians invoked the Civil War and the lost cause to justify their defense of segregation and what they always called the Southern way of life, which really was the white Southern way of life. But it wasn't just white demagogues like George Wallace, Ross Barnett, and their ilk who attempted to yield the memory of the Civil War to a critique of what they saw as a dangerous evolution of American politics and institutions. We need look no further than this gentleman. That's Edmund Wilson, who published Patriotic War, Studies in the Literature of the Civil War in 1962. I point to Edmund Wilson because you can see the grip of the Civil War and the lost cause, the idea that somehow the South had fought a noble cause, on the preeminent literary critic of his generation. Wilson made the striking claim, at least for my present day years, that the Civil War was a war of northern aggression, a northern power grab cloaked in meaningless, and I'm using his words, rabble-rousing and pseudo-moral anti-slavery slogans. Wilson openly admired Alexander Stephens, the tireless defender of secession and the vice president of the Confederacy. Stephens you may be familiar with because he gave the notorious benediction of slavery as the cornerstone of the Confederacy in the early days of the slaveholders' republic in 1861. That Stephens made that benediction of slavery didn't elicit even a wince from Wilson. Instead, Wilson dwelt on what he interpreted as Stephens' fears, his prescient fears of a Leviathan state. Wilson even proposed that in an age of apparent bureaucratic tyranny, 1962, what did he know about bureaucracy compared to 2015? But nevertheless, when he considered the nation's predicament in 1962, he said, the cause of the South is the cause of us all. When he said the cause of the South, he meant the cause of the Confederacy. It's the cause of us all. He urged his contemporaries to turn to the vice president of the Confederacy for wisdom. In 1962, no one excoriated Wilson for his embrace of Stephens. To the contrary, the book is a classic in the canon of American criticism. 5 decades later, the political and cultural milieu has shifted substantially. According to a 2011 Pew poll, nearly half of the public says it is inappropriate for today's public officials to praise the leaders of the Confederacy. Only a third say such statements are appropriate. Perhaps you're already thinking to yourself, what about that Texas license plate? Over the last 5 years, actually longer than that, but certainly over the last 5 years, we've heard a great deal of secession talk. It is true that Representative Ron Paul, or former Representative Ron Paul, and Governor Rick Perry of Texas have long expressed a fondness for the Confederacy and the Confederate Constitution. Ron Paul thinks it's superior to the American Constitution. But it's important to acknowledge that they're Texas politicians. Texas isn't like the rest of the country. Texas politicians are appealing to some of the shibboleths of the Lone Star Republic. They're still fixated on, forget the Civil War, they're still fixated on the Alamo. Otherwise, virtually all mentions of secession in recent years have been pitched as a defense of the 10th Amendment. What is noteworthy is that no politician that I am aware of has explicitly invoked the principles of the Confederacy in their present-day call for secession. In other words, whereas Edmund Wilson found in Alexander Stephens a suitable icon of small government, no politician today is likely to hold up Stephens or Jefferson Davis as a worthy predecessor or inspiration. Of course, modern-day advocates of secession and state rights would do well to distance themselves from the Confederacy, which failed flamboyantly, catastrophically, to demonstrate the feasibility of secession. But during the 1950s and 1960s, white politicians found it proper to wrap themselves in the Confederate flag, not because the lost cause was then any less of a lost cause, but because appeals to the memory of the Civil War resonated with white Southern audiences. If similar appeals had any prospects for success in the present day, we can be sure that white politicians in the South would make it. But they don't. If the Confederacy no longer enjoys political ceilings, what of Abraham Lincoln? All things Lincoln have enjoyed a renaissance of sorts during the past quarter century. I'm convinced that the recent Lincoln resurgence, the Lincoln Renaissance, began a quarter of a century ago with the publication of Gary Will's book, Lincoln at Gettysburg. A truly brilliant piece of work. Wills transformed Lincoln from a cautious, prevaricating politico into a visionary who recast, with his sublime eloquence at Gettysburg, the meaning of the Constitution and the promise of American democracy. On that day, according to Wills, Lincoln gave voice to an expansive and inclusive democracies that consigned the past, or I should say consigned to the past, the pinched and elitist version of American democracy that had been inherited from the nation's founders. Since the publication of Will's book, there have been bushels of books that have burnished Lincoln's reputation. The Lincoln Renaissance is, of course, an implicit critique of contemporary politicians. Like the so-called founders' fad, in the same period of time, there's been tremendous interest in biographies of the founders of the Republic. Like the founders' fad, then, the Lincoln Renaissance is a testament to a desperation to find statesmen sometime in American history who displayed character, courage, and wisdom in office. But the Lincoln Renaissance is also a publishing phenomenon, and politicians cannot easily claim the mantle of Lincoln. For the past 5 years, actually I should say now the past 7 years, we've had a president who's displayed, I have to think, an unbecoming proclivity to both implicitly and explicitly invoke Lincoln as an inspiration and justification for his programs. Were Obama invoking the cautious, prevaricating, calculating Lincoln that inhabits historian David Donald's biography of Lincoln, then Obama might well have found an apt mentor for his style of leadership. But Obama seems to be anxious to align himself with the Lincoln depicted by Gary Wills. Yet it is clear that substantial numbers of Americans have been unmoved by Obama's evocation and invocation of Lincoln. We could linger at length on Lincoln's haunting of the Obama presidency, but in the interest of brevity, I'll repeat my claim that the Civil War no longer has obvious utility in national politics and comparatively little in regional politics. When the Republican Speaker of the Virginia House of Delegates, William J. Howell, opened the 2009 symposium on the Civil War in Richmond, he proposed that the 150th anniversary should focus on the causes and enduring legacies of the Civil War. Then Democratic Governor Tim Kaine, now Senator from Virginia, concurred, declaring that, quote, this time, as compared to the Centennial, this time the Civil War must be treated with analysis and commemoration, end quote. 50 years earlier, it would have been political suicide for any white Southern politician to so clearly throw off tradition in pursuit of a balanced, scholarly interpretation of the war. Then white politicians in the South, as I said, were exploiting the anniversary of the Civil War to harangue about the timeless verities of white supremacy and states' rights. But in 2009, in the former capital of the Confederacy, no less, leaders from both parties agreed on the need for sober reflection and analysis when addressing the Civil War. So now let me turn to the desacralization of the Civil War. And I apologize for resorting to a dry as dust academic phrase like desacralization, because I can't think of a better term. There was a time, certainly 100 years ago, when the Civil War was well-nigh sacred in the United States. Even as recently as the Centennial, the Civil War was treated as a hallowed event. Hallowed was a word that was often used, and of course is in the title of one of the most popular writers ever about the Civil War, the writer Bruce Cape, who wrote a book called This Hallowed Ground. Even, as I said, even as recently as the Centennial, the Civil War is treated as hallowed. So too in Ken Burns' popular PBS Civil War series was the Civil War treated as hallowed. That was in the, was that late 80s, early 90s? I can't remember when that was done. Running through these accounts of the conflict was the presumption that the war was a testament to American courage and principles. That was best in the American character was manifest in Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, and their generation. In the white South, this inclination went even further. And there, the Episcopalian and Presbyterian denominations in particular worked to make the lost cause literally a sacred cause. And I'll just use one example from my childhood. We used to attend an Episcopalian church in Virginia, and there were various flags of all manner of historical relations of the Episcopal Church, but the Confederate battle flag hung in that chapel. And no one would have thought that was odd as a Virginia Episcopalian in that era. Well, against this backdrop, we do well to ponder the significance of the artwork of Carol Walker. Carol Walker is by all means one of the current stars of contemporary American art. Her work has been widely exhibited internationally and in the United States, including Nashville, Atlanta, Dallas, and Raleigh. And some of you, her most recent work that I'm familiar with is the giant sugar sphinx that she did in the Domino factory in Brooklyn that some of you may have read about, or perhaps I didn't see it, but maybe some of you saw it. Well, her art has aroused surprisingly little controversy despite the perversity of her images, her searing depictions of the American South and racial oppression there, and her puncturing of Civil War conventions. What controversy she has aroused has principally arisen among African Americans. If you're unfamiliar with her work, bear with me as I try to offer a brief introduction. Let me just see, how many of you have ever seen Carol Walker's work? So, then you'll bear with me. This will be useful for you. Or I'd like to. Her work ignores conventions that separate high art from other forms of art. And she's embraced the silhouette, an outmoded art form. Most of us probably recall silhouettes as a quaint bygone form of portraiture. How many of you had silhouettes? Did any of you have your parents buy silhouettes if you was a child? A few of you. Right, that's what we think of. And this is just an example of the type of silhouettes that some people, even to the present day, get. Well, this is a form of portraiture that was fashionable during the neoclassical revival of the late 18th and early 19th century. It reminded people, of course, of ancient Greek art in various ways, and it was the cheapest way to record a person's appearance at a time when, of course, there was no photography. So both silhouettes of family members, as well as mass-produced profiles of the nation's great and good, adorned the walls of American homes. So in the early 19th century, you could buy a silhouette, say, of George Washington. So, as I say, this was the way a lot of people who didn't have the money for a painting could have a portrait of someone they loved or someone who they idolized. These historical antecedents do little to prepare a viewer for Walker's radical adaptation of this lost art of silhouettes. She uses the silhouettes to depict scenes of servitude, rape, pedophilia, murder, and other horrors. She accentuates the stark, recurring duality of white and black in her silhouettes. achieving images that are at once elegant and vulgar, transparent and obscure, grim and funny. She portrays a world full of mischief, humor, and violence, where desire and contempt, sex and torture, play and brutality intermingle. Her humor evokes the comedy of the minstrel show, while her imagery invokes the sentimentality of rustic Americana. The massive size and precision of Walker's silhouettes also departs from the conventions of 19th century silhouettes. I'm sorry, I got these out of order. I'll come back to that. My apologies. This is one example of her silhouettes. Unfortunately, I don't have a person standing there, but any one of the silhouettes you see back there is as large as a human being. So it would literally be as though there was a semicircle here, and this whole wall from there to here was covered with these silhouettes. They are very, very big and imposing. So this is a large room. So unlike those small silhouettes that you have of that size on your wall, these take up vast space. So these are life-size silhouettes of entire bodies positioned on large, unadorned walls to create complex scenes with some sort of declared implied narrative. You're supposed to read this not as individual silhouettes, but some sort of story, if you will. The conceit of the silhouette, and this is, I think, the creativity of Carol Walker, is to appreciate that the conceit of the silhouette is to portray the essence of an object by winnowing out extraneous details. Interpreting these and other silhouettes is not a simple task as it seems. Silhouettes acquire their meaning because viewers' minds are unsatisfied with the sparse information that the images convey. So we have to tap into our storehouses of visual cues and tropes to make sense out of them. Every silhouette, in short, is at once a citation of a real object and an invention of the viewer's imagination. So what Walker's doing is she's coaxing us to plumb our storehouse of stereotypes when we look at these. The visual vocabulary of Walker's Spanish and slave plantation world invokes stereotypical images that are drawn from black memorabilia, folklore, historical novels, movies like Gone with the Wind, cartoons, old advertisements, Harlequin romances, 19th century slave autobiographies, and pornography. Walker's most obvious subjects are the racial stereotypes that have long populated American culture, and especially mass culture during the past century. Each figure epitomizes and conforms in some generally legible and familiar formula of black or white identity. And because we recognize these visual cues, we are silhouettes. We can distinguish a white plantation mistress and a slaveholder from a black man, even though all of her figures are black. So let me just give you an example. Here's one of the large scenes to give you an idea. I'm going to be talking about this a little more, but now I'm going to focus in on that. All right, when we look at this, all of the figures are black. But I suspect if you read this silhouette the way I read this, the figure on the left is a Scarlett O'Hara, Southern Belle, right? But she's black. Why do we assume she's racialized as white? Because our stereotypical image of the Southern Belle is, of course, a white plantation mistress. The man on the right, of course, he's Rhett Butler, right? He looks like a Southern aristocratic male. But again, he's black. The little child down here at the bottom, we of course assume is African American. Why? The hair, our expectation, is naked. But then, I want to point out, this is the perversity that she's always playing with. I think the mouse is there. Let me get that mouse in there. What is this? What's going on down here? What are those playing with our stereotypes and the way we can read something into that image. And then she confuses us, challenges us with what it means. Well, Walker's images of the Civil War exploit stereotypes too, but they present the conflict in a strikingly unfamiliar way. Violence and suffering suffuse Walker's war images, but battlefield combat and conventional war scenes are almost entirely absent. In her Battle of Atlanta silhouettes, Walker transforms the battle that had previously been immortalized in that massive cylindrical painting known as the Atlanta cyclorama. Now I'll go back. Pardon me while I don't get seasick here. Okay, that's a very poor reproduction of the Atlanta cyclorama, which is very comparable to the Gettysburg cyclorama, same phenomenon, same period of time, same European tradition of painting these gigantic battle scenes. Well, we're going to see more of Carol Walker's take on the Battle of Atlanta. Unlike the heroic late 19th century painting, the Atlanta cyclorama, which depicts fierce and close combat between Confederate and Union troops, Walker's silhouettes locate the battlefield depicted by artillery firing. This is the battle as we conventionally think of the battle, right? This is a cannon firing way back in the distance. So, this depicts the real battlefield of the Civil War as the home front, where the mundane and systematic violence of desire and domination unfolded. Repeatedly in the Battle of Atlanta, silhouettes combine military and death imagery with depictions of fervid sexual desire. In one silhouette, a black woman clasps the limp body of a soldier on a battlefield. We don't know whether it's the dead body of a lover, a family member, don't know who it is. Another image depicts a black woman licking the rifle barrel of a sleeping soldier. Is it a Union soldier? Is it a Confederate soldier? We don't know. There she is. It's one of those images where, what the heck is that supposed to tell us? There are lots of ways I could read it, but I'll let you read it as you would. She's also crafted simple collages that mix modern advertising images with illustrations from Harper's pictorial history of the Civil War. Here, Walker seems intent on connecting the white mastery of black bodies with masculine posturing in the halls of power and on the battlefield. There's one scene, it's fairly pornographic, so I didn't bring it. Soldiers invading the body of an African-American woman. Instead, I'm going to talk about one that I think I can talk about publicly. Whereas Edmund Wilson depicted Alexander Stephens and his ilk as principal opponents of the Leviathan state, Walker suggests that the libido, at least as much as principle, motivated the Confederate cause. In one collage, Walker depicts the Alabama delegation to Congress. And I regret, here's the other one I mentioned. There you can, I'm sorry, I didn't describe this one. There you can see the cannons in the background and this act of a soldier apparently cannibalizing the leg of what I have to assume is a slave woman. Another example, here's the one, I'm sorry, I should have lingered on these more. This is the one I said of the woman who appears to be kissing the limp body of lover, brother, who knows. But then down here we have is what appears to be the image of two white children sexually torturing a bound slave woman. But that's, again, I'm reading those silhouettes that way. You might read them differently. All right, now on to where I was getting to. Here she's taking this image from Harper's pictorial history. And she's put in these little blurbs of text, which I will mention in a moment. So this is the Alabama delegation to Congress at the time of secession. The delegation members' portraits are garnished with contemporary personal effects in the fashion of word bubbles above comic strip characters. And so those word bubbles include solicitations for diaper lovers, very healthy, thick, shapely women, bisexuals, slave boys interested in sadomasochism, spanking enthusiasts, and sexual partners with other exotic predilections. So, like thick graffiti eyebrows and a mustache scrawled on the portrait of a dictator, Walker's collage is a subversive prank intended to humble arrogance. The juxtaposition of these portraits of these serious slaveholding patriarchs, and their apparent private fetishes that she's made up, as far as I know, highlights the theme of mastery and power in the slave South. Her subjects are masters both of the halls of power and the bedroom, men whose appetites for power and gratification are inseparable. Now, why have I lingered so long on Carol Walker, other than I think her work is very interesting? It's in part because it's difficult for me to imagine a more subversive depiction of the mythic Civil War than Carol Walker's art. I can only imagine the response her art would have elicited a half-century ago during the Centennial. It is inconceivable. Now, I have no evidence for this, but I'm willing to wager. Of course, no one could claim if I lost this wager, but nevertheless, I'm willing to wager that it is inconceivable that Carol Walker's art would have been displayed anywhere in the South during the Centennial. And wherever it was displayed, it would have been denounced as profane. My point about the desacralization of the Civil War is that her contemporary success is not just an evident evolution of aesthetic taste, but also our tolerance for art that mocks every inherited verity about the Civil War. Her artwork has not elicited any controversy. Civil War reenactors, the Sons of Confederate Veterans having been picketing Carol Walker's art when it was shown in Nashville, Atlanta, or Raleigh. So how can we explain the weakening grip of the Civil War on the American imagination? Well, recall the 2009 Centennial Symposium that I mentioned in Richmond, Virginia. There, Dr. Charles Bryant, Jr., president of the Virginia Historical Society, recalled sitting in a living room as a child, listening to his grandfather recount stories about the Civil War and his family's role in it. He credits his grandfather's vivid stories of the Civil War and Civil War artifacts with inspiring his interest in history. Without them, he speculates he would never have devoted his life to a career as a historian for the study of the Civil War. Bryant, who was 10 at the time of the Centennial, is a member of the last generation of Americans with a personal connection to the people who actually witnessed the Civil War. For Americans too young to share such a connection, the war has receded into the distant past. It no longer possesses the same visceral immediacy that it has for Bryant and that it had for earlier generations. I think it's also worth keeping in mind the growth of immigrant populations and the movements of people within the United States that have been accelerated since the Centennial. With each wave of immigration since World War II, and especially after immigration reforms in the 1960s, the portion of the nation's population that had any direct connection to, let alone familiarity with the Civil War, has shrunk. For these Americans, the Civil War is just one of many different and distant historical incidents that one may read about in history texts. The Civil War, the French Revolution, the Great Mutiny, the South American Wars of Independence, they all happened long ago to other people. Simultaneously, during the past half-century, large numbers of non-Southerners have migrated to the South. Significantly, since 1970, more African Americans have moved into the South than have left the region, a reversal of more than a half-century of a massive migration of African Americans out of the region. Many of these new migrants to the South, or I should say return migrants to the South, are unversed in, ambivalent toward, or hostile to the interpretation of the Civil War that previously was championed by white Southerners. These far-reaching demographic trends have necessarily shaped how both the news media and state and local governments have commemorated the sesquicentennial. I'm working my way back around to Michael Hill from the North Carolina Department of Archives and History, who observes that many of the state's immigrants, North Carolina's immigrants, have little or only passing interest to the war, and so have not encouraged public officials to undertake extensive ceremonies and activities to mark its anniversary. Planning for the sesquicentennial story has had to take into account the nation's diversity and the myriad and contradictory attitudes about the Civil War, even in the states of the former Confederacy. So if the Civil War doesn't resonate with most Americans the way it once did, it is, of course, still a catalyst for periodic controversy. But I want to stress one of the other ways in which the war is over, as I'm facetiously putting it, is that contemporary controversies unfold in surprising ways and mobilize surprising constituencies. There are still familiar squabbles about Confederate monuments. You may have heard that a few years ago, Memphis renamed several parks that previously bore the names of prominent Confederates, and they removed monuments from some of these parks. Now, we can hardly be surprised that some Southerners have reservations about honoring the memory of Nathan Bedford Forrest, a Confederate commander notorious as a slave trader, as a commander whose troops conducted the Fort Pillow massacre, as one of the founders of the post-bellum Ku Klux Klan. But if the contours of the controversy in Memphis are familiar, I now want to turn briefly to a controversy in Reidsville, North Carolina. It's perhaps less. I'm using this not because it's in North Carolina, but because I think it's a very telling story. This monument was put up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy in Reidsville in the early 20th century. This is an old historic postcard. You can see it was located in a traffic street. Made good sense in the days of wagons, right? I mean, how fast can a wagon go? How reckless can a wagon driver get? The problem was, once automobiles came about, the monument was exposed. It has been hit at least 3 times by drivers who were either inept or drunk. And the last time it was hit, it was toppled, and the Royal Confederate on the top was broken into pieces. The United Daughters of the Confederacy decided they had enough of restoring this monument, and they also thought it was more appropriate to move it out of downtown Reidsville and move it into a cemetery, where it could honor Confederate soldiers, but in a way that was less offensive to 21st century mentality, and was not vulnerable to being hit by automobiles. So here's the part of this controversy that's interesting. The United Daughters of the Confederacy were sued by the Sons of the Confederacy for violating their 14th Amendment rights to be able to see this monument when they were driving the streets of Reidsville. In other words, the United Daughters of the Confederacy were going to deprive the Sons of the Confederacy of their equal rights under the law. Well, this contest between the Sons of the Confederacy and the United Daughters of the Confederacy went on until, as you would well imagine, eventually a judge threw this out. It was ridiculous. But the monument is still in pieces, tragically, and has not been restored because they haven't been able to raise money, and there's such bitter feelings about it. The reason I raise this is not a controversy between, progressives on the one hand and conservatives on the other. These are two groups dedicated to preserving the Confederate memory, arguing about how best to do it in the 21st century, and not doing a very successful job of it. And what should we make of a monument in Monroe, North Carolina, dedicated on December 8, 2012? It has its origins among the local African-American community and not among whites. The granite marker, I'm sorry, I got these out. There's the granite marker. Lists the names of 10 black men and is located at the front of the Union County Cemetery Old Confederate Monument, which in turn stands in front of the Union County Courthouse. When it was dedicated, and I'll go back to that, here's the dedication ceremony. there were about 250 people who gathered, both black and white, including Maggie Rice, who you see there tearful, 90-year-old daughter of one of the men memorialized on the monument. Her father and the other men cooked, cleaned, and built fortifications for the Confederate Army. For their service, the men later received small state pensions in their old age. So the marker, bring it back again. The marker reads, in memory of Union County's Confederate pensioners of color, in honor of courage and service by all African Americans during the war between the states. Now, as you may know, neo-Confederates during the past several decades have made much of so-called black Confederates. Scholars have skirmished with the sons of Confederate veterans and others who represented the service of black slaves in the Confederate struggle as freely given. In fact, the overwhelming majority of blacks who dug trenches, built railroad tracks, performed all manner of logistics in camp chores, and otherwise performed the grunt labor of the war effort, were impressed slaves. In other words, they served the Confederate cause against the wishes of their owners, and presumably against their own wishes. They were drafted slaves, just as the horses and mules used by the Confederate Army were often drafted against the will of their owners. When interviewed, I'm sorry to do this, but I'll take it back to her again. When interviewed about the marker, the daughter of one of the slaves offered a clear grasp of the complexity of history that was being acknowledged by the ceremony in the monument. Quote, there's always been markers of white men who served. Now North Carolina is distinguishing itself by saying there were people of color who were part of this team. As this new monument suggests, the memory of the Civil War is likely to play itself out in surprising ways in the future. But the memory is like dying embers that generate little heat and less light. By the time the bicentennial, I anticipate that the Civil War will have taken its place beside the English Civil War and the wars of religion, as an event that our successors will be taught is important, but which elicits puzzlement over why and how it could have happened, if it elicits any sentiments at all.